If not, okay. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
And now we'll move to item 5. And what I'd like to do is maybe take this one out of order. Probably have the enforcement panel come up first. Nancy Foley, the chief of the Department of Fish and Game's Law Enforcement Division. Larry Allen, the district attorney for Sierra County. Kathleen Keneally from the Attorney General's office. She's the senior assistant attorney general for the Natural Resources Law section. And Lynn Thorpe, deputy attorney general for the Natural Resources Law section, also at the Attorney General's office. Thank you all for coming. Nancy, I'll have you start off first. Okay.
My name's Nancy Foley. I'm the Deputy Director for the Department of Fish and Game and Chief of the Law Enforcement Division. The topic that we're talking under is meeting the mission of the California Department of Fish and Game and the California Fish and Game Commission. And so I just wanted to give you a 20,000-mile view of some of the responsibilities that we have. There are 159,000 square miles of land within the state of California. There's over 1 million acres of fish and game properties, 1,100 miles of coastline with 7 major ports. We patrol out to 200 miles to sea. We have over 300 million pounds of commercially landed fish, 30,000 miles of rivers, 66,000 businesses that deal in fish or fish products. We have over 1 million vessels registered in the state of California. We have 37.4 million Californians, and we have 392 game wardens. That's the lowest number of game wardens per capita in the United States. And so then you have to wonder what happened. You know, we're a very green state, but what happened to get us there? And I guess that's the question that we're all asking. If every game warden from my position on down, that's the 392 that we're talking about, had a district, that would mean 500 square miles per game warden, including me. That's, to think that we're meeting the mission of the California Department of Fish and Game or the mandates that are placed on us is unreasonable at this point. The good news is that we have a very dedicated staff. And we do the best we can with the resources that we've been provided. And I get a quarter every time I say that. But we have game wardens that will respond out of their homes. They get phone calls in the middle of the night, and they'll respond to a spotlighting or a pollution event. So we have a very dedicated staff, and I think that's what's holding it together. But we never know, when it's gone too far. So I'm glad that the Legislative Analyst's Office talked about Florida and Texas. Florida has 750 game wardens. They did a staffing study about 3 years ago, understanding that they have a coastline very similar to the state of California. They have, at that time, they had about 14 million people, 19 million now. They don't have the natural diversity that we have in the state of California. They don't do some of the environmental protection work that we do or habitat protection work that we do. In that staffing study, it said that they needed, even with poor data that most wildlife agencies have, another 250 officers. Florida's game wardens get paid about 10%, between 5 and 10% less than their highway patrol. In Texas, they have 540 game wardens. They get paid the same rate as their highway patrol. 95 to 98% of Texas is private property. About half of the state of California is public property. We have more responsibilities on public property, obviously, than we have on private property. So we have significant challenges in the state of California as we go forward. So knowing that part of my job is to look to the future, I know that in my lifetime, certainly not in my career lifetime, will we have 1,500 game wardens. That's not going to happen. And yes, I'm old enough to retire now, so that's really not going to happen. But how do we use these opportunities for partnerships, for joint training, to get a force multiplier? We have 6,000 highway patrol officers. Can we train the highway patrol officers in some venue to understand what wildlife resource crime is, so that at least they can spot it. Does that mean that we'll have a game warden to respond? I'm not sure, unless we have some other kind of integration in there. Are there opportunities for joint purchasing and joint training with some of our other state law enforcement? I believe that there are. So we'll look for those opportunities in the future. And then we have to find a strategy to change the paradigm. If I've got several newspaper articles here, and we'll just take a more recent example. We had a juvenile great white shark that was cut off of a pier in Southern California about 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago now. It ran headline news for 7 days. On the same day that that juvenile great white shark was taken illegally off of the pier, there was a boy that was beaten by his father and thrown off a ferry. That headline was below the great white shark and ran for 1 day. The great white shark ran for 7 days. There's a tremendous amount of emotion and passion tied to wildlife in the state of California. We have to figure out how to take that and shift it into action, not only for the support of the natural resources, but also in the courts, and to see how we can change that paradigm. And just to give you another idea, we catch less than 5% of the violators that are out in the field. And that's a study that's been out for a number of years. So if we're catching less than 5%, and last year we wrote about 14,000 tickets with the 392 game wardens, we don't have that many. We have 37 vacancies right now, maybe 38 tomorrow, I'm not sure. You know, it just means that there's a lot out there that are violating the laws set both by the legislature and by the commission that we just can't get to. And then a study that was done in the mid-1990s said that there was over $100 million per year in illegal commercialization of wildlife in the state of California alone. And at that time, that was second only to the illegal drug trade. And since the mid-1990s, because resources, the value has gone up and more people are taking them for illicit commercial purposes, that value has only raised exponentially in my mind. So we've got significant challenges. We have our partners in the court system that we all have to come together to find some ideas as to how to better prosecute these cases and better protect our natural resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm Laurie Allen. I'm the Sierra County District Attorney. And I can assure you I wasn't called here because I'm the Sierra County District Attorney. I was one of the original circuit prosecutors. I've been a prosecutor for 22 years, and I was one of the original circuit prosecutors. And for those of you, I'm assuming you all know what the Circuit Prosecution Project was, but is. But I handled the environmental cases in northernmost California. And when I was sworn under the district attorney, the elected district attorney, to come into his office and handle nothing but environmental cases. Given the fact that my territory was mostly Northern California, that meant I was dealing a lot with fish and game, CAL FIRE, you name it. So that's what I did for 4 years. And of course, it's a very, 5 years. It's a very, very effective project. It was a real challenge to be able to prosecute wildlife cases in different venues. And the cases are very complicated. They're very difficult, particularly the type of cases I was dealing with, which was complex conspiracies, commercializations, and things like that. The problem was, of course, funding. And every year it was, well, we can only guarantee you a job for another year. So believe it or not, it was I took a job in a county where I have to run for re-election, or in a county that hasn't re-elected a district attorney in 50 years. So believe it or not, I have more security where I'm at. And I'm in my third term, by the way. But as a prosecutor for that length of time, I've handled all sorts of cases: homicides, you name it, kidnappings. Did nothing but child molest cases for 2.5 years, and I've made national news 3 times, and they were all wildlife cases. The people care about this, and once it gets in front of them, they really care about it. Nancy brought up the shark, and that's true. That's exactly what happens. This stuff goes viral. and it becomes well known, and it evokes a visceral reaction. So people really care that we're out there enforcing this stuff. Now, with respect to how do we deal with this and how do we get into what happens with wildlife cases is they usually go into a DA's office, particularly a larger DA's office. It goes in the misdemeanor level unit where we have very new prosecutors that don't understand the concept of what's going on here, or they don't care because they want to move up the ladder and to do homicides and stuff like that. And some of these cases are very serious, and some of these cases should be treated seriously. And we've come to the legislature a number of times asking for more felonies, and we get shoved away because our prisons are overcrowded and we can't do felonies. But some of these things deserve felony level treatment, and for the most part, somebody initially sentenced on one of these cases as a felony wouldn't go to prison anyway. And now, under the new Prison Reform Act, they're not going to go anyway because they'll do their prison sentence in a local jail. So, revisiting the idea of felonies, and I can think of a whole bunch of areas to go, killing an eagle maybe. But there are two specific areas where felonies need to be addressed. That's the commercialization of wildlife, which Nancy touched on. And the second one is the abalone. The abalone case, we have, people are going to poach bears. There's always going to be bears to poach. But the abalone is so fragile that if you don't stop the abalone poaching, there won't be any more abalone. It will be gone. It will be, and it has been eviscerated in certain areas of this state where it doesn't exist anymore because of commercialization of abalone. And so the abalone stuff is important. I had a case in Ukiah that went for 4 weeks. 4 solid weeks. I had 35 witnesses. It was a conspiracy. They were taking the abalone, they were taking it down to San Francisco and selling it. Of those 35 witnesses, 2 of them were San Francisco cops. They watched a hand-to-hand sale in San Francisco of abalone. Now, we come here to the legislature and we ask for felonies. And what they do is, well, we're not going to give you felonies, but we'll up the penalties. You know what the penalty? You know what the penalty, including penalty assessments, the fine for selling 1 abalone is? $42,000. That's worth that. It doesn't work. I've got people that can't afford their rent, and we're going to get $42,000 out of them. It's not a deterrent. They don't care, and we'll never collect it anyway. And what they're really concerned about with the felony provisions is not that they're going to go to prison, because they don't care about that. It's the implications for firearms. It's the implications for immigration. That's what they care about. And that's where the hammer comes from felony, the ability to pursue felonies in those cases. Abalone and commercialization of wildlife. The felony, if we can charge those as direct felonies, and sometimes we do them conspiracy theories, and that's what I was doing with the abalone thing, a conspiracy. But conspiracy is a complicated thing to set up. It's a complicated thing to prove, whereas if we could just file as a felony case, then we have a whole different thing. Not only that, but if we could file felony charges on abalone, it wouldn't have gone into the unit in because San Francisco wouldn't prosecute it. Even though they had a hand-to-hand sale, a slam dunk case, they wouldn't prosecute it because it goes in the misdemeanor unit. The people don't. Oh, this is another fish case. They don't understand the penalties. They don't understand the implications for abalone. If it had been able to be charged as a felony, it would have gone to the felony unit, an environmental unit who understood it, who would have taken a closer look at it, who would have understood what they had when it came into their office. And that would have made a whole difference in how that case was handled. Instead of me doing a very complicated, expensive case up in Ukiah, it would have been a real straightforward case in San Francisco. But that's not the way it went. And so those kind of things have those kind of implications for the efficiency of how things are handled in a enforcement setting. And so, again, I would ask you to revisit the issue of felonies, and there's probably a whole lot of them, but those two, for sure, the commercialization, people that are making money off poaching should face felony sentences and potential. And again, it's not. We have a whole different issue now because we're always turned away because we can't fill our prisons. Well, you're not filling your prisons anyway. They're not going to prison now. They're going to do it in county jail. But the implications from felonies are enormous. And it gives us a tool that would really help us. And again, you get a greater scrutiny at the prosecutorial level. And so I'm here to answer. And I'll tell you, we appreciate the wardens. In my county, I have a warden that's probably going to bring me 5 felonies this year, in the next couple of months when people are out in the woods. And they're going to be drunk drivings. There are going to be felony DUIs. There are going to be people with guns that shouldn't have them. There are going to be domestic violence cases. There's going to be those kind of things that this warden is going to bring me, I guarantee you, in the next couple months. Those wardens in our county are very important tools to law enforcement, and they run into some very dangerous situations out there. And so I'm here to answer questions, and thank you for your time listening to me.
Thank you very much, Mr. Allen. Kate, Lynn, go ahead.
Sure. Hi. I'm Kathleen Keneally. I'm the Senior Assistant Attorney General for the Natural Resources Law section at the Attorney General's office. I'm going to speak a little bit about the structure of the AG's office and how we work with Fish and Game on these issues. And then I'm going to leave it to Deputy Attorney General Lynn Thorpe, who has actually handled several of these cases for Fish and Game. First, I'd like to start off by saying that the Attorney General asked me to come here today. She was invited to speak to you, and she asked me to come and let you know that she's very supportive of the work that you're doing and to indicate to you our support as an institution of the work that the department is doing in these enforcement actions. My section, the Natural Resources Law section, represents the Department of Fish and Game along with almost 100 other client agencies. We do work for these agencies across the board. Our work is primarily civil. We do a lot of defensive work for the agencies. We also, more and more, are doing both civil and criminal enforcement cases. And we do have a long history of partnering with Fish and Game to bring these criminal enforcement actions and to use the resources of our office to support the agency where it's appropriate. And, you know, one of the things I've heard as I've been sitting listening in the audience this morning is the problem of funding. And I think that that's an issue that cuts across the board, and it certainly is affecting our office. We have fewer resources, we have less money, and we are always asked to do more and more. So we're always trying to kind of thread the needle with our resources and our effectiveness. And that's true not just in this context for Fish and Game, but across the board. And the way that we look at cases is they typically get referred to us by our client agencies, and then the Attorney General has discretion to decide whether or not we're going to take the case. And that's very true in the criminal context. We do take cases on a referral basis, and we look for cases that have statewide impact. We look for cases where the Attorney General sees a need to help either get consistency, to make a point that maybe needs to be made on a statewide basis. And we also do cases that might be viewed as routine as a way of assisting local prosecutors. And we've certainly done many of those cases for Fish and Game over the years through the use of our individual deputies and also in partnership with the CDAA. And I think that, you know, the other, aside from funding, which is, of course, I think just an ever-present challenge, coordination is something that I think that we could improve among our office and the CDAAs and Fish and Game. And I think that the interesting thing is part of the process of coming here to testify before you and to kind of tell you about what we do, I think has also helped to initiate a dialogue between the Attorney General's office, CDAA, and Fish and Game about how we're going to approach these issues in the future. But certainly having the support of your effort in looking at these problems across the board is very helpful for us. And I think that we will, continue to look at ways to do these cases efficiently, and we even talked this morning about maybe an ombudsman type of process or some way to create structures or improve the structures we have for doing the cases in the way that is the most efficient so that the Attorney General can provide support in ways that are appropriate for our office and also help build up those the prosecutions that happen at the local level through the district attorneys. And with that, I will cede the mic to Lynn.
Good afternoon. My name's Lynn Thorpe. I'm a Deputy Attorney General. I've handled half a dozen criminal matters for Fish and Game over the years. The way that we do them, the Attorney General's office, is that the case comes to us because for whatever reason the local district attorney can't or won't handle the case. So we are coming from outside in someone else's place. And one of the hurdles that, as I understand it, one of the issues you want to hear about is hurdles that confront prosecution here is that in a regular criminal prosecution, the deputies that handle it, district attorneys, know the elements. They've known them for years. They learned them in law school. Here, in environmental one, Fish and Game one, the documents may be this, and it is daunting if you were a new attorney. You have to learn something completely different. It's not just the same old elements for a DUI. So you have that first off. Suddenly this looks like, and this is a pejorative, this looks like a paper case. There's a lot of paper to read. There are a lot of new issues that I must learn. And as Larry mentioned earlier, these are issues that are being thrust upon brand new attorneys. Not experienced attorneys that can deal with this, but brand new attorneys. And suddenly that Fish and Game case doesn't look quite as interesting as the very easy to prove DUI over here. One of the cases that I had to do with the siltation case in El Dorado County. The referral packet was multiple inches high. It was a great case. An extensive segment of a stream was rendered essentially sterile with siltation. But for local reasons, the district attorney couldn't or wouldn't take that case. So the other hurdle that we have is by the time the Fish and Game folks figure out that this misdemeanor is not going to be taken by the local, we're coming up against a statute of limitations. So you have a one-year statute of limitations, and I get it in month 10. And that makes it difficult for me to get that case ready to go. So those are some other issues. But a lot of those are cured by the heavier issues that if some of these things are now made felonies, you get a correspondingly longer period of time. You get a more seasoned attorney that's going to look at it at the local level. It takes on a higher significance. And quite frankly, it's easier to tell your judiciary the importance of it because the legislature has already deemed it to be a felony. One other thing that might merit some thought for your organization is that changing, clarifying that some of the Fish and Game misdemeanors are in fact strict liability crimes would be helpful. There is case law that suggests or that indicates that certain violations are, and there are other case law that suggests that violations, for example, of 1600 are strict liability, but it's not absolutely clear, as it is for 5650s. So that would help as well. The reason that helps is you have a lot less jury nullification, because if you go to some of these counties, you're going to have issues with some jury pools not being particularly interested in the 1600 case or siltation event. So that's a legislative change that can be contemplated. So with that, I'm open to questions.
Thank you. Do any of the members have questions for the panel? Dr. Graber?
Let me see if I can articulate this. This is way out of my area of familiarity. There aren't enough wardens. If there were more wardens, there would be more arrests, but then the arrests aren't being prosecuted anyway. Help me understand. I mean, ultimately, what I'm most concerned about is outcome on the ground. In other words, that our natural resources are protected. What's the most efficient way to reduce this incredible level of take that you're describing? Oh, and by the way, one other thing, could you give us some examples, maybe egregious examples, of what is meant by wildlife commercialization? And I don't care who answers these.
Sure. Wildlife commercialization is any time that somebody makes a profit off of wildlife that isn't already allowed for in either the Fish and Game Code or the Fish and Title 14.
So if you poached something and sold it, that would be an example?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So egregious ones, I know that there have been some abalone illegal commercialization rings that have made the husband and wife made over $200,000 in a year on abalone sales. So people make a significant amount of money. One bear gallbladder here, if you buy it for $50 to $500, you get it to Asia, it goes for $2,000 an ounce. We've arrested people that have bought bear gallbladders that have tickets, airline tickets in their pockets, ready to go. So there's a lot of commercial deer cases here in the Sacramento area. They're up and down the state. So almost anything that we have, from reptiles to raptors, abalone to bear, if there's a dollar value on it, somebody's going to take it. And you said, we could have 1,500 game wardens and we could write a lot more tickets, but they wouldn't get prosecuted. We're making a pretty broad generalization. Not all tickets fail prosecution. There are some counties that don't prosecute, depending on the amount of money coming into the county, the budget cuts that they're facing. I suspect that D.A. Allen, when he gets a fish and game ticket in, there's a prosecution on it. In San Francisco, we can't guarantee the same thing for every ticket, but there are cases that get prosecuted in San Francisco.
In some of the more rural counties, some of this stuff is really important to us because our election base are hunters and fishermen, and they want to see there's nobody that hates poachers more than hunters and fishermen, and are more rabid about having those things prosecuted. And all parts of a bear go for something. On a dollar, and these cases that Nancy is talking about are complicated cases. Some of these are conspiracies that go all over the place, have multiple defendants, have sources for revenue. It's just like drugs. It's exactly like drugs. You work those cases just like you do a drug case. You put conspiracies together. You have informants. You have buys, undercover buys. It's just like working drugs, and the profit for a gallbladder is the same.
I think it's true that for any kind of crime, you're always going to have, lots of crimes that happen and they don't get prosecuted. And at the end of the day, it's a policy decision as to what you're going to go after. And, that happens at the local level with the district attorneys deciding what they're going to follow up on. It happens in my office when we look at criminal cases and decide what we're going to take. But it also happens at the legislature when the legislature says, if we offer an amendment to a statute or we offer some kind of legislative solution to try to create a statute that creates a better penalty structure, or to try to deal with the problem that Lynn talked about with specific intent on statutes. If the legislature will have the resolve to help us fix some of those things, then we can target our efforts. And I do think that more planning in that regard should happen. It has been happening. I think we can do a better job with it. And it is a place where the Attorney General's office can play a role to help to define certain kinds of cases. Complicated white-collar environmental cases are cases that we're suited to help with. Putting the funding and other questions aside, if we have the resources to do them, we certainly can do them because we have a statewide presence and we have experience. We do a lot of work for Cal Recycle with recycling fraud, and it's a very complicated financial type of case where we're doing enforcement. They're criminal cases. So I think that the opportunities are there, even though that there certainly is a lot of there are a lot of violations of the law that happen that don't get enforced to judicial conclusion. But I think in an era of tight resources, we have to be selective. We have to decide where we're going to take our shots and then try to focus our resources as best we can. And I do think that's what we have been, attempting to do over the years. But obviously, every year the budget situation seems to get more and more dire, and we're working with less and less. And I think we must focus harder and harder to kind of try to hit that sweet spot to get the maximum number of, convictions that we can get.
Mr. Hollingsworth and then Mr. Kellogg.
Chief Foley, would you be able to possibly provide an estimate of the amount of field time that wardens spend as a percentage of their time on stream bed alteration, OSPR spills, pipelines, things that are, quote, on the environmental side versus things that are more purely fish and game and T&E?
I don't have any of those numbers right in front of me, although for OSPR-related spills, OSPR, in essence, contracts with the law enforcement division for positions, law enforcement positions. And so they've paid for, we've got 26 positions over in, that are held within OSPR that still report within our chain of command, the law enforcement division's chain of command. So, but the funding comes from OSPR. So those people, their primary responsibility is oil spill investigation. So they're 100% over there. And if they move outside of the marine zone, then we shift fund from somebody that's in the marine zone still looking for, on a surveillance capacity for oil spill. For 1600s and some of the other things that you were talking about, we're just going now to an electronic daily activity report where we're trying to break out some of those things so that we can better help you, better help answer some of those questions as to exactly where we're spending our time. However, it's very difficult for a law enforcement officer because as you're going from point A to point B, you never really know, where to charge that. Because until you make your first contact, you don't know if it's fishing, hunting, 1600, suction dredge, or anything else. So it gets fairly complicated. But if you're looking for some, like a guess, I can certainly get that back to you.
That would be interesting to know, just from a perspective of how do you focus the mission of the Department of Fish and Game, and if we're going to do that, what is going to be the you mentioned the term force multiplier. What is going to be the force multiplier of either adding new things incrementally, as we've done the last 2 decades, for wardens to investigate, or taking a big chunk of that away and redefining the mission? Does that provide a force multiplier for the poaching and the commercialization issue?
Oh, thank you. Mr. Bonham?
Just quickly, 3 things. I want to thank each of you for coming today. It's a complex issue to sort through, and I look forward to kind of careful and thoughtful analysis here at this level and at the stakeholder group level. So I found today very informative. Thank you. Second, I want to thank Mr. Allen specifically for his remarks about the hunting and angling community and how they view poaching. As a pretty diehard angler, I can confirm your belief about their passion around poaching. And then lastly, I want to introduce myself kind of directly to Miss Keneally and Mr. Thorpe, and look forward to coming over and introducing myself to those in your division. I think we're a primary client of yours, and I'd like to come
Nice to
over
meet you.
and build a relationship.
Do any of the other members have any comments?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Yes, thank you. I do have a question for you. And one of them, it's a process question, and that is, you've given us a lot of really good ideas, and I wondered how that's going to be enfolded into the process. Is it going through the stakeholders group, or is it in the commission, or how are these recommendations going to be done?
Actually, I think you were reading my mind. Because one of the questions I was going to ask is there are several good ideas that have come out here, and I'm trying to think about it in the context of what to send back to the stakeholders, because this particular and the reason why we structured the panel this way was to go from the field to prosecution, and that's really an issue that did come up in several of the stakeholder groups. So I have funding, revisiting felonies, and maybe wrapped up in that is statute of limitations, strict liabilities, and the question of the policy question of how you do selection and prioritize the cases. Are there any other things that the groups should be looking at? The stakeholder members have, we shared the letter from Mr. Huffman. Assemblyman Huffman wrote a letter to the Attorney General, I think on some ideas or thoughts on an environmental enforcement working group that Assemblyman Huffman and Rick Frank were co-chairs. And in there were several ideas, and I don't know if you want, if you'd like to talk about that, or if there are other things that the stakeholder group should be focusing on.
Well, one thing that we could do is, we've had a dialogue. I guess it was a week or so ago that, the Attorney General was invited to kind of come and participate. And so we started talking about the issues that we've been discussing today on the panel. And, one thing we could do, I think, easily is create, some items to submit back in a more organized fashion, but just to, give you something that would fill out the list of things that we've talked about today. I think we could probably do that very quickly. And that might be the most helpful way to do it, rather than to kind of try to ad hoc, try to fill in the blanks a little bit today.
Thank you. That would be great. Okay, I think. Thank you very much, everyone. Very informative. Next, at the last Blue Ribbon Commission meeting, there was a request for someone to talk about the NCCPs and local government. And then also someone from the oil and gas industry. And so we have John Kopchik from the East Contra Costa County Habitat Conservancy, and then Tony Francois from the Western States Petroleum Association. And in your packet, you have, for the NCCP portion, there's a map, and then there's also a document called California Habitat Conservation Planning Coalition. It's a green document. Karen Keene from from CSAC was unable to attend, but in your packet they also have some information, because I had asked her, what to provide some information to us about the challenges and opportunities on local government planning. And as it just so happens, the documents that she submitted relate to Contra Costa County. So it's made a nice loop. So with that, John, maybe I'll have you start first. Thank you.
Good afternoon, members of the committee and commission. My name is John Kopchik. I'm the executive director of the East Contra Costa County Habitat Conservancy, which is a joint powers authority formed by Contra Costa County and 4 cities in East Contra Costa County, cities of Clayton, Pittsburgh, Oakley, and Brentwood, to implement what I think is the first natural community conservation plan approved in Northern California. I work at Contra Costa County in essentially the planning department called Conservation and Development, where I've worked on Delta issues with Fish and Game for many years, and I also staff the Board of Supervisors appointed committee that spends the meager fine revenues that result from the enforcement by the wardens of Fish and Game rules. So I've had, over my past 16 years, I've interacted with Fish and Game in a variety of ways. I think the feature of which I'd like to speak most about is the Natural Community Conservation Plan. I have become a devoted champion of NCCPs. I think that they are the best tool we have to ensure conservation of land for all wildlife, including threatened and endangered species, particularly in areas where there are land use conflicts. I think it's essentially a really fantastic tool and something that the department should be proud of and should be nurturing. Our plan happened fast. That meant it started in 1995 or 94 with some kind of studies and exploratory efforts. Officially started in 2000 and was finished in 2006. So with 11 years of build-up, $2 million of planning costs, we arrived at a plan that will conserve 30,000 acres of land in one of the fastest, used to be, one of the fastest growing regions of the state. And so there's very significant land use conflicts in East Contra Costa County. It has been an area with lots of development, and the areas that the developers like to develop tend to be the flat grasslands that many of the endangered species like to inhabit. And I think that the role Fish and Game played in getting that plan going was outstanding. I think they worked strategically with Fish and Wildlife to basically coax, push, nudge, everything in their arsenal to try and get us to do this plan. And I think that the reason that that was so important is that as a county, and as the cities, we have authorities that Fish and Game doesn't have. We control the land use pipeline. We approve developments. Fish and Game, Fish and Wildlife have a permitting role, but it doesn't really allow them to plan and to try and avoid the best habitats and to conserve the best habitats. So it's only when we all work together that we're able to come up with a way to conserve endangered species and promote economic development. And that's essentially what our plan tries to do. It will, as I say, conserve 30,000 acres over the next 30 years for a variety of endangered species and for all wildlife species. It will also serve as perhaps one of the most accessible and most expansive a series of urban parklands that the nation has. We will be partnering with East Bay Regional Park District. So all of these 30,000 acres, well, nearly all of the 30,000 acres will have public access and will be not only preserved for enjoyment of species, but also for the enjoyment of the public. If we weren't able to all work together, 10 different agencies had to approve this plan, we wouldn't have been able to achieve some of the significant advantages of HCPs. The one that I think I most like to dwell on is the idea that through an HCP, NCCP, you take all of the effort that is wasted on confrontation with lawyers, with fighting, with delay about where development will happen, with permitting, and you invest that resource into actually conserving the land. And I think it is a good government case study in terms of how to make regulation more effective and to have regulation achieve the outcome that you want. And that, to me, is kind of defines the value of HCP and CCP. You could talk also about the ways in which you have a limited ability to fund Fish and Game in terms of your staff positions. How can essentially one biologist regulate all the biological impacts in our county? They can't. But when they sign us up for an NCCP, all of a sudden the plan encounters that all of our participating cities in the county are now also regulating species. And so it's a force multiplier, to use that metaphor you were talking about before, to help achieve the mission. What's in it for the county? Well, we care about conservation as well. We would like to see these lands conserved. We also want certainty and local control, and that's what the NCCP can deliver. East Contra Costa County might be the first NCCP in Northern California, but it's not a big NCCP relatively. The reason I included the booklet was just to show you that the NCCPs, especially the land use NCCPs in the state, and also the ones that are just habitat conservation plans, have gotten together, and we're coordinating. And many of these are much larger than our plans in San Diego and Western Riverside and the Coachella Valley. And many of them are approved, and the entire I-80 corridor has plans in development. So this is a really growing tool that started small and is now much bigger. Collectively, all these plans will result in the conservation of 1.4 million acres, which I think I heard mentioned that your fish and game properties are about 1 million acres right now. So these are 1.4 million new ones, and they're tough acres. It's not like we're buying 100,000 acre parcels out there. I mean, these are urban parcels. The parcels in San Diego don't come any pricier. These are beachfront properties in some cases. So these are hard-fought acres. Collectively, we have a really crude, not backed up estimate that if you just look at the total number of acres of development to be covered and take a conservative estimate about the economic value of that we're talking about in the neighborhood of $1 trillion or more of economic development that will be streamlined by these plans. And so East Contra Costa is just one small example of an overall sort of larger procession of these plans that I think are going to be really important for conserving species and ensuring that the public supports the regulations because they become success stories. And our plan took effect just as the economy tanked, so we've had almost no development fee revenue. But in just really in the last 20 months, we've already conserved 8,500 acres in about 20 separate transactions. The state has put in about 15% of the funding. So the state, this is a big state mission, but they've put in only 15% of the funding for the acquisition. The federal government has put in 45%. Foundations have contributed around 11%, and local, mostly the East Bay Regional Park District, has contributed a little under 30%. So that's making the plan popular right now. There will be bumps in the road as we go down this. We will have to figure out how to deal with endowments. Currently, if we hold the endowment at the county or at the East Bay Regional Park District, we'll be subject to government code restrictions on how we invest it. We'll be investing it at 1.5%, and that's not how the UC system invests their endowments. I mean, we're going to need support from Fish and Game to sort of explore safe but practical ways to invest these funds. We're going to need help with trying to make sure that as we coordinate permitting for species, that we also coordinate permitting for other regulated resources like wetlands and waters. You have a regulatory role through 1600 with waters, but so do a whole bunch of other state and federal agencies. And if we coordinate the species regulations through HCP, but that hits a brick wall with under Porter Cologne or Clean Water Act, then the development community will not be very happy about our plan. They will feel that it was a bait and switch, and that this is not really delivering the promised efficiencies in permitting, and we'll be working at cross purposes. So we need Fish and Game to really prioritize NCCP and go to work to try and ensure that their partner agencies also see the value and work with us, because this will be a huge challenge. Some things that I just wanted to mention about other ways in which features of Fish and Game that could be emphasized would be Wildlife Conservation Board. All the federal and state money that we have secured so far for land acquisition has come through the Wildlife Conservation Board. I think we've 16 or 20 grant agreements in the last 20 months. It's been fantastic working with them, very efficient. I mean, we were expecting to hear, and we originally were negotiating options with 18-month option periods, and now we can turn the transactions around in about 4 months. But WCB is doing this with a skeleton crew. If you look at another great agency like the Coastal Conservancy, I don't know the numbers, but I would guess they have 2 or 3 times as many people working and probably less grant money to divvy out. So Wildlife Conservation Board is doing yeoman's work with less than full resources.
Excuse me, John. Yeah. I wasn't aware of this, but we actually have somebody coming in at 1 o'clock.
So be quiet.
Yeah,
yes.
So if you can wrap it up, that would be good.
I'll just wrap up. I think that I don't have any. Obviously, you have budget limitations. I don't know what you can recommend to try and I mean, all these things are important. Enforcement's important. If there weren't enforcement of 1600s, then these developers would not want to participate in the HCP and CCP. So you need that. All these things are important, but investing the regions with the ability to be strategic and have some autonomy, but also be coordinated with the top levels of headquarters so that NCCP can be supported is really key. And I'd be happy to answer questions and really appreciate the opportunity to share some ideas with you. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Tony, maybe I have you start. Thank you.
Thank you, members of the committee and the commission, and Carol for inviting us here this afternoon to briefly speak to the Office of Spill Prevention and Response, to gratuitously congratulate both the director and Mr. Oglesby. I think this is the first time I've seen either of you in your new capacities. The Western States Petroleum Association represents the major petroleum industry participants in the Western United States. That includes integrated international oil companies, as well as independent refiners and independent oil producers. We, through a couple of fees that we pay, fully fund the Office of Spill Prevention and Response in implementing the state spill prevention and response program. About a third of that program's budget is paid over to the California State Lands Commission, which deals mainly with offshore platforms. OSPR's role is focused on transfer of petroleum products across state waters. I think the basic thing I want to say today is that the industry is very supportive of OSPR and of the Spill Prevention and Response Program. It's important to us that it operate well, that it be properly funded, and I think the basic message I want to deliver today, given the time, is to encourage this entire process to follow up on at least the hypothetical question that Dr. Graber posed earlier, which is the sort of the role of OSPR within Fish and Game. I think this is an organization which, rather than being, well, I put it this way, and I don't want to try to, incite controversy over this. There is some history of OSPR's resources being used outside of OSPR. The agency is taking steps to address that and to prevent it in the future. What WISPA has recommended in the past, as well as the OSPR Technical Advisory Committee, is that the current organization, which cuts several OSPR staff away to other organizations within Fish and Game, be reversed, that the OSPR administrator have direct organizational control of the entire OSPR organization. Recognizing this is kind of a ticklish issue, that does include the 26 law enforcement positions that were spoken about earlier. But our view is that is a more sound way to ensure both the best level of performance for the organization and the best level of protection for the organization's financial resources. One thing that I did want to bring to your attention, granted that time is short, is recent authorization by the legislature to allow borrowing of $40 million out of the Oil Spill Response Trust Fund as part of an effort to balance the state's books. And we recognize that special funds are frequently, in the term, rated to make the books square. However, I mean, in the past, that's tended to be sort of excess funds lying around in various, BTH and consumer services permitting programs. The trust fund is not extra money lying around. That is the state's response resource for orphan spills, where there's not a responsible party that can be identified and brought into action to address the spill. At very least, we would encourage this organization, when it reports to the legislature, to, frankly, issue a hand slap for authorizing that borrowing, and strongly encourage that not happen again in the future. These program resources are too important to begin to be thought of by the state as sort of something they can easily access for other purposes. We're more than happy to follow up with members of the commission and the committee, as well as the stakeholder group, on specific recommendations that we've got for organization within Fish and Game dealing with OSPR and their funding. The OSPR Technical Advisory Committee issued a very good report this June that addresses several of these issues, and without prejudging what anybody's sort of ultimate question or ultimate answer to the question would be, the Technical Advisory Committee did offer as a final recommendation at least consideration that OSPR be made formally independent of Fish and Game, barring the effective implementation of other reforms. We think that's a valuable discussion to have so that it gets fully vetted, and if that's not the answer, we know why, and we know that we're the course that we are pursuing is the best one. So I'm available for questions, and I think it's just a minute after 1.
Thank you, Tony. Tony, I was wondering if you can, we'll take you up on your offer to put something in writing, and then we'll ensure that it's distributed to all the members here as well as to the stakeholder group.
As well as if you could direct us or provide us, either provide us or direct us to where to find some of the discussions on OSPR as an independent agency, or if there's been discussions of OSPR and other similar responsibilities that are upon Fish and Game now being moved to another agency within the resources agency or elsewhere.
We'd be happy to do that, Senator. And then the final thing, it's my recollection, but in addition to the TAC recommendations, the Bureau of State Audits has a performance audit underway that will look at organizational issues as well. The initial estimate of the state auditor was that would be available by January or February of the coming year, so that may sync up with the review, the strategic vision work. So,
thank you. Do any other members have questions? Okay, if not, thank you very much, John and Tony. It was very, very informative. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now we're going to quickly move to the public comment period. Is there anyone from the public who would like to make a very brief comment? And I do apologize. I didn't realize we were double booked here. So, okay. Right here.
Thanks. Good afternoon. Thanks for taking brief comment. My name is Doug Johnson. I'm the Executive Director of the California Invasive Plant Council, which is a statewide science-based nonprofit organization working to protect California's wildlands. As we all know, invasive species are a major conservation threat to California, and I believe this vision process provides a great opportunity to strengthen the state's response to invasive species. There's a lot of good efforts going on the ground out there, but those efforts need to be strategically coordinated to be really effective. In some cases they are, and in some cases they aren't. In the area that our organization works in, invasive plants of wildlands, there is a bit of a capacity gap, especially with the Department of Food and Agriculture eliminating their programs. And seeing the work that's being done to study what's happening in other states as well as to inventory what's happening within California agencies, I think there's an opportunity to learn from some of the newer infrastructures that are being developed in other states to address invasive species and including invasive plants of wildlands. I know offhand New York and Florida both have dedicated bodies that are closely associated with their fish and wildlife agencies that focus on invasive species coordination. So I urge you to take this opportunity to look for ways to strengthen California's response, whether it's within Fish and Game or elsewhere within the Natural Resources Agency. Thanks.
Thank you, Doug. Is there anyone else from the public who wants to make a comment? If not, we'll go to the last item, which is any committee follow-up, staff direction, future meetings. Well, the one thing I'll say about the future meetings at this point is, as I indicated before, because of the transition we'll be going through, Melissa and I will be going over the calendar, and I'll go out on a limb and say that I suspect the next meeting will probably be in mid-October. But I don't have a specific date at this point.
I have a question I want to direct to the Executive Committee. And I'll be really honest, I'm a little bit frustrated. We have a product or several products that are expected of us, and no one has explained to me how the stakeholder groups, the Commission, and the Executive Committee are going to work together or work separately to produce these products. Who's going to write the report? I've asked the Secretary this in a letter, which he hasn't responded to. But since there is a very short timeline, and I'd like this thing to succeed, I think we need some kind of workflow. I'm looking at Chuck for no particular reason.
Well, let's see. The Secretary did respond. You should have received the email probably last week. So I apologize.
He responded by saying he got my letter and he'd be getting back to me.
No, that's not exactly correct. I think perhaps you and I should sit down and have a discussion. Are there any other comments, questions from the members? If not, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.